On the night of January 7, 1610, Galileo Galilei pointed a telescope at Jupiter and saw something that no human being had ever seen before. 4 small points of light, arranged in a line beside the planet, present one night, shifted the next, gone from one side, and reappeared on the other the night after that. He watched them for 2 weeks before he was certain of what they were. Moons. 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, moving around Jupiter in regular, predictable, mathematically describable paths in exactly the way that planets, according to the system of Nicolaus Copernicus, moved around the Sun. Not around the Earth, around Jupiter. Galileo understood immediately what he was looking at. He also understood immediately what it meant. If moons orbited Jupiter, then not everything in the heavens moved around the Earth. The Earth was not, as the Church had taught for over 1,000 years as a matter of theological certainty, the fixed and immovable center of a universe arranged by God specifically around human habitation. It was, instead, one of several bodies orbiting the Sun, a fact that Copernicus had proposed mathematically in 1543, that Galileo now had observational evidence for, and that the Catholic Church had spent 67 years refusing to accept because the consequences of accepting it were too large to absorb without dismantling the cosmological framework on which a significant portion of its authority rested. Galileo published his observations in 1610 in a work called Sidereus Nuncius, The Starry Messenger. It was the fastest-selling scientific publication in the history of print to that point. Copies circulated across Europe within weeks. Within months, every educated person in the Western world had heard of what the telescope had revealed. The Church's response took 23 years to fully materialize. When it did, it produced one of the most consequential confrontations between institutional authority and empirical evidence in the history of science. A trial, a forced recantation, a sentence of house arrest, and a prohibition on the telescope itself that was meant to contain what the telescope had already, irreversibly, shown. You cannot unsee Jupiter's moons. The Church was about to spend the better part of a century trying. To understand why the telescope was theologically dangerous, you have to understand what the sky meant before it became something you could examine closely. The heavens, the stars, the planets, the moon, the sun, were not merely astronomical phenomena in the cosmological framework that the medieval Church had inherited from Aristotle and Ptolemy and integrated into Christian theology. They were the architecture of divine intention made visible. The structure of the universe was the structure of God's plan, every sphere in its place, every motion regular and perfect, every distance proportional and meaningful. The Ptolemaic model, the Earth at the center, surrounded by concentric spheres carrying the moon, the sun, the planets, and the fixed stars, was not merely a scientific hypothesis about celestial mechanics. It was the physical description of a theologically ordered universe. The Earth was at the center because human beings, as God's primary creation, lived there. The heavens moved in perfect circles because circles were the perfect geometric form, and God's creation was perfect. The stars were fixed in their sphere because the divine order was fixed and eternal. Every element of the Ptolemaic cosmology had a theological interpretation. Every theological interpretation had been built into the structure of church doctrine over centuries. Every piece of church doctrine that depended on the cosmology was now at stake if the cosmology was wrong. This is why the telescope was dangerous. Not because it showed things that were aesthetically disturbing. Not because the moons of Jupiter were theologically offensive in themselves, but because the moons of Jupiter were evidence. Direct, observable, repeatable evidence that the cosmological framework that the Church had incorporated into its doctrinal structure was wrong. And if the cosmology was wrong, then the theology built on it required examination. And if the theology required examination, then the authority of the institution that had been teaching the theology as revealed truth required examination. The telescope was not a scientific instrument in the eyes of the men who condemned it. It was an instrument of institutional disintegration. And they were not wrong. The telescope was not invented by Galileo. This is among the most persistent misconceptions in the popular history of science, and correcting it matters because the actual origin of the instrument reveals something important about why it took so long to become scientifically significant. The telescope was invented, or more precisely, first patented, by a Dutch spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey in 1608. He applied for a patent for a device he called a kijker, a looker, that used two lenses to make distant objects appear closer. The Dutch military was immediately interested. A device that could resolve enemy formations at a distance before the enemy knew they had been seen was of obvious strategic value. The Dutch States General evaluated the instrument, decided it could not be kept secret because too many people already knew how it worked, and declined the patent, but paid Lippershey for multiple copies. Within months, the design had spread across Europe through the networks of lens grinders, instrument makers, and natural philosophers who corresponded across national and religious boundaries with the frictionless enthusiasm of people who understood that the world contained interesting things to know. Galileo heard of the device in 1609 and immediately grasped something that Lippershey and the Dutch military had not. The military application of the telescope was tactical, seeing the enemy before they saw you. The scientific application was different in kind. If the instrument could magnify distant objects, it could magnify the most distant objects accessible to human observation. It could magnify the sky. He built his own version, improving on the design until he had achieved a magnification of approximately 30 times, far beyond the 8 or 9 times that early Dutch instruments managed. And in August 1609, he demonstrated it to the Venetian Senate from the Campanile of San Marco, showing them that the instrument could identify ships approaching from a distance of 2 hours sailing while they were still invisible to the naked eye. The Senate doubled his salary. He pointed it at the sky 3 months later. What Galileo saw between November 1609 and January 1610 constitutes the most concentrated sequence of astronomical discoveries in the history of science before the Hubble Space Telescope. The moon was not smooth. Its surface was covered in mountains and craters, a terrain as varied and as physically complex as the Earth's. This was not supposed to be possible. The Aristotelian cosmology required celestial bodies to be composed of a fifth element, the quintessence, that was perfect, unchanging, and incapable of the kind of geological variation that mountains and craters implied. If the moon had mountains, it was made of something, and that something was subject to physical forces. It was not perfect. It was not quintessential. It was a rock. The Milky Way was not a diffuse glow of celestial material. It was composed of individual stars, thousands of them, too faint and too numerous to resolve with the naked eye, but individually distinct through the telescope. The fixed sphere of stars was not a uniform surface. It was a populated depth. Venus showed phases, waxing and waning like the moon, which was only explicable if Venus orbited the Sun, not the Earth. A Venus orbiting the Earth would not show full phases because it could never be seen with the Sun behind it from an earthbound perspective. And then Jupiter's moons. Each discovery individually was significant. Together they constituted a comprehensive dismantling of the Ptolemaic cosmological system, not by argument, not by mathematics alone, but by direct observation that anyone with a telescope and clear skies could reproduce. This was the instrument's specific danger. It was not a theory. It was not a calculation. It was a piece of glass that you pointed at the sky and looked through. Anybody could use it. Anybody could see what Galileo had seen. The Church could not control the instrument. What it could control was what the instrument's findings were permitted to mean. The Inquisition's engagement with the telescope and with Galileo personally was not immediate. There was a period between 1610 and 1616 during which the scientific community debated, the Church observed, and Galileo, characteristically impatient and characteristically incapable of leaving an intellectual adversary with the last word, published, argued, and made enemies with the specific efficiency of a man who understood he was right and could not quite comprehend why this was not sufficient. In 1616, the Congregation of the Index, the body responsible for maintaining the list of books Catholics were prohibited from reading, declared the Copernican system formally heretical and placed Copernicus's foundational work, De Revolutionibus, on the index of forbidden books. Galileo was summoned to Rome and warned. The warning was, by the standards of what the Inquisition was capable of in 1616, relatively gentle. He was told not to hold or defend the Copernican view. He was not imprisoned. He was not tried. He went home. He spent the next 14 years writing a book, The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, published in 1632, was structured as a conversation between three characters debating the merits of the Ptolemaic and Copernican systems. The character defending the Ptolemaic system was named Simplicio. He was portrayed as slow, confused, and consistently outmaneuvered by the other two characters. His arguments were the arguments that Pope Urban V, who had been Galileo's supporter and friend before the publication, had personally provided to Galileo as the best available case for the geocentric position. Galileo had taken his patron's arguments and put them in the mouth of a character named Simplicio. The Pope was not amused. Galileo was summoned to Rome in 1633. The trial that followed was not, in its formal structure, about the telescope or about the moons of Jupiter or about whether the Earth moved around the Sun. It was about whether Galileo had violated the 1616 warning by publishing the dialogue. He had, clearly, deliberately, with a dedication that suggested he had calculated the risk and concluded that the argument was worth making regardless of the personal consequences. He was wrong about the personal consequences. The Inquisition found him guilty of suspicion of heresy. He was required to formally recant his support for the Copernican system, to state, publicly, that the Earth did not move and that the Sun was not at the center of the universe. He was sentenced to house arrest at his villa in Arcetri, outside Florence, where he remained for the last 8 years of his life. The story that he muttered, "and yet it moves," after the recantation, is almost certainly apocryphal. It first appears in a source written over a century after the event. But the story exists because it captures something true. The recantation changed nothing about what was in the sky. Jupiter's moons continued to orbit Jupiter. Venus continued to show its phases. The moon's mountains did not smooth themselves into Aristotelian perfection because an old man in a Roman court had been compelled to say they were not there. The church had won the argument in the room. The sky had not been consulted. The prohibition that followed Galileo's trial extended, in practice, to the telescope itself. In Catholic countries, Italy, Spain, Portugal, the Habsburg territories, the use of the telescope for astronomical observation that might produce findings inconsistent with church cosmology was subject to inquisitorial oversight. Natural philosophers who wished to work on astronomical questions navigated a landscape in which the instrument itself was associated with heretical conclusions, in which publication of certain findings required ecclesiastical approval, and in which the safest professional posture was to avoid the most sensitive questions entirely. The effect was not a complete suppression of astronomical observation in Catholic Europe. It was something more insidious. A systematic dampening of the most consequential research, a redirection of talent toward questions that did not threaten the institutional framework, a generation of natural philosophers who understood which observations were publishable and which required the kind of caution that slowed science without stopping it. The most significant astronomical work of the 17th century was produced in Protestant countries. Johannes Kepler, working in Protestant Germany and Austria, developed the mathematical laws of planetary motion that described, with precision that Copernicus had not achieved, the elliptical orbits of the planets around the Sun. Christian Huygens, working in the Dutch Republic, discovered Saturn's rings and Titan, Saturn's largest moon. Isaac Newton, working in England, developed the mathematics of universal gravitation that explained why the planets moved as Kepler's laws described. The cosmological revolution that Galileo's telescope had initiated was completed systematically and comprehensively in the countries where the telescope was not prohibited. In Catholic countries, the prohibition protected the cosmological framework from its critics. In Protestant countries, the framework was dismantled by the same instrument, by different hands, without the Church having sufficient institutional authority to prevent it. The Church formally rehabilitated Galileo in 1992, 359 years after his trial. Pope John Paul II acknowledged that the theologians who had condemned Galileo had made an error, that they had confused the specific content of Scripture with the cosmological framework through which they were interpreting it, and that this confusion had produced a confrontation between faith and science that need not have occurred. It was a generous and thoughtful acknowledgement. It came 359 years too late for Galileo, who died under house arrest in 1642, blind, his astronomical work largely complete, his formal recantation on the record, his private views unchanged. He had been right. He had known he was right. The instrument that showed him he was right still existed, still worked, and was still being used by the Protestant astronomers of Northern Europe to build the scientific structure that would eventually make the question of the Earth's position in the solar system not a matter of theological controversy, but a matter of established fact, taught to children in every country on Earth. The telescope won. Not because it was powerful, not because its supporters were brave, though some of them were, not because the argument for its use was so compelling that the institution opposing it could not resist. It won because of what it showed. And what it showed was true. And truth, unlike a book, can be placed on the index of forbidden things. But it cannot be made to stop being true. The moons of Jupiter were orbiting Jupiter before Galileo saw them. They were orbiting Jupiter while he recanted. They are orbiting Jupiter now, and the institution that spent a century trying to determine what that meant for the authority of the men who had built their power on a different explanation of the sky, that institution installed a telescope on the roof of its own astronomical observatory in 1582. 30 years before Galileo pointed his at Jupiter, the Church knew what the sky contained. It just wasn't ready, in 1610, for everyone else to know it too.